Colonel James Harrington's scarred hands trembled as he spread his weathered sketches across the boardroom table. The echo of artillery fire from the Korean DMZ still ringing in his ears decades later. "With all due respect, Colonel," sneered Richard Holbrook, the project's young lead engineer, "your military experience doesn't translate to civil engineering. This isn't building a bunker." At 62, James felt every one of his years as the room full of engineers with advanced degrees and designer suits exchanged knowing glances, dismissing the combat veteran whose calculations were scrawled in a battered notebook he'd carried through battlefields where he'd constructed bridges under impossible conditions. Could a man who once built crucial infrastructure while dodging enemy fire save thousands of lives when sophisticated computer models failed? Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of unsung heroes who prove that wisdom often comes from unexpected places. James unlocked the door to his modest apartment, the faint scent of coffee and old books greeting him. He hung his worn jacket beside a framed photo of young men in military fatigues, their faces frozen in time. Sighing heavily, he placed his leather notebook on the kitchen table, the same notebook those engineers had mocked just hours ago. Outdated methods, they'd called his work. But what did they know of building under fire? He moved to his study, walls covered with engineering texts, military commendations, and a faded map of the Korean DMZ. His fingers traced the thin blue line marking the Imjin River, where in 1953 his unit had been ordered to construct a bridge under impossible conditions. "We lost 4 men that day," he whispered to the empty room. The phone rang, pulling him from the memory. "They're idiots, James," said the voice on the other end, Dr. Sarah Chen, his former student and now a respected engineering professor. "Your calculations are sound. Doesn't matter. They've made up their minds. This isn't just about professional pride," Sarah said firmly. "If that bridge design is flawed like you believe, thousands of people could be at risk," he finished. "I know. My uncle sits on the review board. He owes me a favor." James stared at the old photo again. Young faces, brave men who never made it home, men who had trusted his calculations with their lives. "I'm too old for this fight, Sarah. With respect, Colonel, that's bullshit. You didn't give up when mortars were falling. Don't give up now." The silence stretched between them. "Set the meeting," he finally said. After hanging up, James pulled out a dusty box from under his bed. Inside lay his medals, including the silver star he'd received for the Imjin River operation. Beneath them was a folded letter from General Maxwell, his commanding officer. "Your unorthodox approach saved hundreds of lives. Never let anyone tell you the book is more important than the result." James hadn't built that bridge by the book. He'd built it with an understanding of how materials behaved under stress that no classroom could teach. He opened his notebook and began calculating again. This wasn't about proving himself to those young engineers. This was about preventing another disaster. Because when bridges failed, people died. He'd seen it happen once. He wouldn't let it happen again. The Westbrook Bridge wasn't just another infrastructure project. For the twin cities of East and West Harbor, it represented healing, connecting communities, long divided by more than just the rushing waters below. James reviewed the project files Sarah had provided. $500 million, 2 years of construction, a marvel of modern engineering that would support thousands of vehicles daily, while withstanding the region's notorious storm surges. At least, that was the plan. He spread the blueprints across his living room floor, comparing them with newspaper clippings about the project. Mayor Jenkins called it a bridge to our shared future. Business leaders praised the economic opportunities. Community activists celebrated the planned bike lanes and pedestrian walkways. No one questioned the design itself. "James, you're early," Sarah said, opening her office door at the university. "Uncle Philip can see us at 4. James nodded, laying out his notes. "I've identified the critical flaw." Sarah examined his calculations. The harmonic resonance factor during high winds combined with specific river current patterns. She looked up. "They're using standard modeling that doesn't account for it." "Because standard models are built for standard conditions," James replied. "But the Westbrook River isn't standard. That deep channel on the eastern bank creates vortex shedding, unlike anything their computers are programmed to consider. Sarah's face paled. And when the seasonal storms hit, catastrophic oscillation, like Tacoma Narrows, but worse. They spent the afternoon preparing their presentation. James insisted on simplicity, clear mathematics that even known engineer could understand. By the time they arrived at Harborview Tower, where Philip Chen waited, James felt the familiar calm that had served him in combat, the calm of absolute certainty. Philip Chen greeted them warmly, but with obvious reservation. "Sarah, Colonel Harrington, I have arranged this meeting as a courtesy, but I should be clear. The board is satisfied with Holbrook's team." "Sir, with respect, they're missing something critical," James said. "That's a significant claim against one of our top engineers." "It's not about reputation," James replied. "It's about physics." Sarah touched her uncle's arm. "People's lives could depend on this, Uncle Phil." Philip sighed. "You have 15 minutes tomorrow morning. Make them count." As they left the building, James gazed across the harbor to where construction equipment already gathered. In his mind, he could see the completed bridge and its potential failure point, clear as day. "They'll listen," Sarah assured him. But James had seen that look before, the polite dismissal people gave to those they considered past their prime. He'd need more than calculations tomorrow. He'd need to make them see. Night fell as James transformed his apartment into a war room. Papers covered every surface, calculations flowing from one page to the next. He hadn't worked with this intensity since Korea, but his mind remained sharp, focused on the hidden flaw others had missed. The city lights glimmered outside his window. As he traced force vectors and stress points, the mathematics revealing what computer models had overlooked. It wasn't the standard calculations that concerned him, those were impeccable. It was the intersection of multiple uncommon factors, the river's unusual current pattern, the wind tunnel effect created by surrounding buildings, and the specific resonance frequency of the proposed construction materials. When three unlikely events coincide, he muttered, remembering his old commander's words, "That's when bridges fall and men die." The clock showed 3:17 a.m. when James finally identified the critical equation. He stared at the result, checked it 3 times, then sat back in his chair. The bridge's safety margin was less than half what regulations required during certain weather conditions. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, still working. "Found it," he replied. "They've miscalculated the harmonic resonance by ignoring the eastern vortex. Can you prove it convincingly?" James looked at his notebook, filled with calculations too complex to explain in a 15-minute presentation. "Not with words alone," he answered. He pulled out an old footlocker from his closet, retrieving equipment from his military engineering days. By dawn, he had constructed a rudimentary scale model of the bridge and its surroundings. He photographed the model, then set up a small fan and water pump to simulate the conditions he predicted would cause catastrophic failure. He recorded video as the model bridge began to oscillate, the vibrations growing until the structure failed precisely at the point his calculations had identified. At 7:45 a.m., he showered and dressed in his only suit, the one he wore to military funerals. The jacket hung looser than it once had, but the silver star pin on his lapel still caught the morning light. Sarah arrived at 8:30, eyes widening at the transformed apartment. "My God, James, did you sleep at all?" "I'll sleep when the bridge is fixed," he said, gathering his materials. "I found something they can't ignore." As they drove to the meeting, James thought about all the men who had trusted him with their lives in Korea, young men crossing hastily constructed bridges, never questioning whether the structures would hold. The weight of that responsibility had never left him. Now, decades later, thousands more lives might depend on whether a room full of engineers would listen to an old soldier. The boardroom fell silent as James finished his presentation. His model demonstration had captured their attention, but Richard Holbrook's dismissive smile remained unchanged. "Impressive theatrics," Colonel Richard said, "but we've run sophisticated computer models, accounting for all variables. Your ... craft project doesn't override months of analytical data." Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "With respect," James replied, I've shown mathematical proof that your models missed a critical variable. The Eastern Channel vortex is well within tolerance. Richard interrupted. Besides, we've added redundant support systems that your calculations don't account for. A young man at the end of the table cleared his throat. Actually, I'd like to review the Colonel's findings. James recognized him, one of the engineers who had laughed the loudest at his sketches days earlier. Marcus, Richard warned, we have deadlines, and we have an obligation to safety. Marcus Wells replied, surprising himself with his boldness. If there's even a chance the Colonel's right. The meeting adjourned with no decision, but as James packed up his materials, Marcus approached. Your harmonic resonance calculations, he said quietly, they're using a different methodology than I've seen before. That's because I learned it in the field, not a classroom, James replied. When you're building under artillery fire, you develop shortcuts. Marcus hesitated. I'd like to understand your approach better. Could we talk? Later that afternoon, they sat in a coffee shop near the harbor, watching construction equipment being positioned for the bridge project. My father was military, Marcus admitted. 101st Airborne. He always said the best engineering happens when lives depend on it. Smart man. He died in Afghanistan. Eyed on a road that was supposedly cleared. James nodded, understanding the weight behind the words. I've been running simulations since your presentation, Marcus continued, opening his laptop. If I adjust the parameters to include your Eastern Vortex calculations, ... He turned the screen toward James. The simulation showed the bridge oscillating violently under specific conditions, exactly as James had predicted. This would mean recalculating everything, Marcus said. Delaying construction by months? Richard would never. This isn't about Richard, James interrupted. It's about the thousands of people who will cross that bridge every day. Marcus stared at the simulation again. My career at the firm would be over if I challenged Richard on this. Probably, James agreed. But you'd be able to look at yourself in the mirror. Marcus closed his laptop. Let me run more tests tonight. If they confirm your findings, ... double quotes, he took a deep breath. I'll stand with you at tomorrow's emergency review. As they parted ways, James watched the young engineer walk toward the firm's gleaming headquarters. He recognized the conflict in Marcus' choice between career advancement and professional integrity. He'd seen that same conflict in young officers in Korea, when following orders meant risking lives. Some had chosen wrongly. He hoped Marcus would choose right. The data speaks for itself, Marcus concluded, pointing to his laptop where the simulation showed clear structural weaknesses under specific conditions. The boardroom remained silent. James watched as board members exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of concern and calculation. Financial calculation. Philip Chen finally spoke. Richard, how do you respond to these findings? Richard Holbrook stood, smoothing his expensive suit. Respectfully, Mr. Wells is a junior engineer who's been unduly influenced by Colonel Harrington's unconventional theories. His smile never reached his eyes. Our models incorporate decades of validated engineering principles, not field experience from a war zone. My calculations aren't shortcuts, James interrupted. They're adaptations for real-world conditions your computers aren't programmed to consider. Richard sighed, theatrically. Colonel, we appreciate your concern, but modern bridge design uses finite element analysis and computational fluid dynamics that weren't available during your active service. The laws of physics haven't changed. Since Korea, James replied, his voice steady despite his growing frustration. No, but our understanding of them has evolved considerably. Richard turned to the board. I've taken the liberty of consulting with Professor Watkins at MIT. He distributed a memo. As you can see, he's reviewed our models and finds them more than adequate. James leaned forward. Did Professor Watkins see the Eastern Channel data? Richard's hesitation was brief, but telling. He reviewed all relevant variables. That's not what I asked, gentlemen, Philip interrupted. We need to make a decision. Construction crews are mobilized and materials are being delivered. Delays cost money, and mistakes cost lives, James replied. The vote was quick and decisive. Construction would proceed as planned. Outside the boardroom, Marcus looked devastated. I should have been more convincing. You did your part, James assured him. But they made their decision before we ever walked in. Sarah joined them, anger evident in her stride. This is ridiculous. That memo from Watkins was superficial at best. He didn't review the actual site-specific data, because Richard didn't provide it, James said. He cherry-picked what Watkins would see. That's unethical, Marcus whispered. It's career preservation, James replied. Admitting a flaw now would mean admitting he missed it in the first place. They watched as Richard emerged from the boardroom, surrounded by board members offering congratulations on the project's continuation. This isn't over, Sarah insisted. We can appeal to the city council, the mayor's office, with what? Marcus asked. The board has Professor Watkins backing them, who will listen to us. James looked toward the harbor, where construction equipment was already being positioned. We need irrefutable proof, something they can't ignore or explain away. How do we get that? Sarah asked. James remembered nights in Korea, watching water patterns around temporary pylons, observing how currents changed with weather conditions, understanding what computers couldn't program because they'd never seen it. We monitor the construction, he said. Document everything, and we pray we find our proof before the first storm hits that bridge. Richard noticed them talking and approached, his smile now genuine with victory. No hard feelings, Colonel. Perhaps engineering has simply passed you by? James met his gaze steadily. For your sake, Richard, I hope I'm wrong. But you're not backing down, are you? Richard's smile faded. Would you, if you truly believed thousands of lives were at risk? Richard's expression hardened. Don't interfere with my project, Colonel. You've had your hearing. It's over. But as Richard walked away, James knew it was far from over. It had only just begun. The VA hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and TEMA. Familiar scent to James after all these years. He navigated the hallways with practiced ease, nodding to staff who recognized the old colonel who visited faithfully each month. Room 317 hadn't changed. Same beige walls, same window overlooking the courtyard, same weathered man in the bed by the window. Johnny, James greeted, setting a small potted plant on the nightstand. Sergeant John Mercer's eyes brightened with recognition. Colonel brought me another victim to water, I see. James smiled. The last one's still alive, isn't it? Barely. John adjusted himself in the bed, arthritis making his movements deliberate. You look troubled, sir. James had never been able to hide anything. From his old sergeant, they'd spent too many nights in foxholes, reading each other's silence. It's this bridge project, James admitted, settling into the visitor's chair. Something's wrong with the design, but no one will listen. Tell me. James explained the situation. While John listened intently, his mind still sharp despite his failing body. Reminds me of M. John finally said. I was thinking the same thing. Captain Reynolds didn't listen then either. The memory surfaced with painful clarity. Their unit had been ordered to cross a bridge built by another company. James, then a lieutenant, had noticed irregularities in the support structure. The captain called me overcautious, James recalled. Ordered the convoy to proceed anyway. And halfway across, the third span collapsed. John finished. We lost Peterson, Mitchell Santos, and Dawkins. James added quietly, for good. Men, John's gnarled hand reached for James's arm. You tried to warn them. Wasn't enough, was it? Is that why you're fighting so hard for this one? Still trying to save them? James hadn't considered that, but the truth of it resonated. Maybe. You know what I remember most about that day? John's eyes grew distant. Not the collapse itself. It was watching you afterward, directing the rescue. Then rebuilding that span in 24 hours, with artillery falling around us. He shook his head. You kept recalculating, making adjustments no one else understood. Field adaptations, James said. That's what they're missing now, isn't it? The book learning versus the real world. James nodded. Exactly. So what are you going to do about it? Keep fighting, I suppose. What else can I do? John's laugh turned into a wheeze. Same stubborn lieutenant, never knew when to retreat. As James prepared to leave, John reached for his hand. "Remember what General Maxwell used to say?" James smiled at the memory. "Sometimes the best view of a problem isn't from headquarters. From the mud, get your boots muddy, Colonel," John advised. "That's where you'll find your answer." Walking back to his car, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. John was right. He'd been trying to fight this battle in boardrooms, but the real evidence would be found at the construction site itself. The ghost of Vimjin would never rest if he gave up now. He owed it to them, to Peterson, Mitchell, Santos, and Dawkins. Prevent another disaster. This time, he wouldn't fail. The construction site buzzed with activity as James leaned against his car, watching through binoculars. Workers in bright vests moved with purpose, pouring concrete for the first support pier on the western bank. "Should you be doing this?" Sarah asked, standing beside him. Richard might consider it harassment. "I'm on public property," James replied, "and I'm not interfering." For 3 weeks, James had observed the construction daily, taking notes in his battered Korean War notebook. He'd established a friendly rapport with some of the workers, old-timers who respected his military background and engineering knowledge. Colonel, a grizzled foreman named Pete, waved him over. "Come see this pour. Biggest one yet." James nodded to Sarah and walked to the security fence. Pete let him through against regulations, but the old veterans had formed an unspoken alliance. "Notice anything?" Pete asked, as they watched concrete flowing into the massive form. James studied the operation with practiced eyes. Flow rates inconsistent. Vibration teams falling behind. Pete grinned. "Knew you'd catch it." He shouted instructions to the crew, then turned back to James. "These youngsters rely too much on instruments. Sometimes you need to feel the work." After inspecting the pour, James examined the preliminary stress test data Pete had shared with him. Another violation of protocol that could cost the foreman his job. "These readings," James pointed. "They're within tolerance, but closer to the margin than they should be." "That's what I thought," Pete nodded. "Engineering team says it's fine, though." "Of course they do," James muttered. Back at Sarah's university office that afternoon, they analyzed the data more thoroughly. "The initial stress patterns match your predictions," Sarah confirmed, comparing the numbers with James's theoretical models. "Not enough to raise alarms yet, but the trend is concerning." Marcus arrived, looking nervously over his shoulder. "I can't stay long. Richard's watching everyone who talks to me now, because he knows you have a conscience," James replied. Marcus placed a flash drive on the desk. "Internal testing data from the first support pier. I've highlighted some anomalies in the material response characteristics." Sarah plugged in the drive and examined the files. "These concrete core samples show microfracturing patterns consistent with our resonance theory." She looked up. "They're using a higher sand to aggregate ratio than specified." "Cost-cutting," Marcus explained. Richard approved the change as an optimization. James felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach. He's adjusting the materials to make them fit his models, not adjusting his models to account for real-world conditions. "That's not the worst part," Marcus said, lowering his voice. "I found modified test results in the system. The actual readings were showing higher stress factors, but the reports to the board were altered to show values within optimal range." "That's fraud," Sarah whispered. "It's also impossible to prove," Marcus replied. "The original data was overwritten. I only saw it because I happened to be monitoring the live feed during testing." James stared at the construction site visible through Sarah's office window. "We need more evidence. Undeniable evidence." "Richard's too careful," Marcus said. "He's covering his tracks." "Then we need to force his hand," James decided. "The seasonal storms are coming. That's when the bridge will show its vulnerabilities." "You want to wait for a potential disaster?" Sarah asked, alarmed. "No," James replied. "I want to predict it with such precision that they can't ignore us." He turned to Marcus. "We need to place our own monitoring equipment on those piers. Can you get us access?" Marcus paled. "That would definitely get me fired. Maybe worse." "And if that bridge fails?" James asked quietly. "Could you live with that?" The young engineer's expression hardened with resolve. I'll find a way. As they left Sarah's office, James noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The first storm system of the season was approaching, earlier than expected. They were running out of time. James's apartment had transformed into an engineering lab. A scale model of the Westbrook Bridge dominated his living room, built with meticulous attention to detail, including the unique riverbed topography that created the eastern vortex. "You built this yourself?" Marcus asked, examining the model with professional appreciation. "Old habits," James replied, adjusting the small water pump that simulated the river's flow. "In Korea, we always built models before committing men and materials." Sarah filmed as James demonstrated how specific wind and current conditions created resonant vibrations in the bridge structure. The model bridge swayed visibly when all factors aligned precisely as his calculations had predicted. "This is compelling," she said, reviewing the footage. "Visual evidence is more convincing than equations for non-engineers. Will it be enough?" Marcus asked. James shook his head. "Not without corroborating data from the actual construction." Thanks to Marcus's access and Pete's cooperation, they had placed discrete monitoring sensors on the completed support piers. The data transmitted wirelessly to James's laptop, providing real-time measurements that the official monitoring system didn't track. "Local news might run this story," Sarah suggested. "My department has connections at Channel 7. 2 days later, they sat in the waiting area at Channel 7 News, their presentation materials ready. The reporter who greeted them, Vanessa Kim, seemed genuinely interested. "So you're claiming the new bridge is potentially unsafe?" she clarified after their explanation. "Under specific conditions," James specified. "The design doesn't account for a unique interaction between the eastern channel vortex and certain wind patterns, and you have proof." They showed her the model, demonstration, and the initial stress test data. "This is concerning," Vanessa admitted, "but I'll need to get comment from Holbrook Engineering and the city before we can run anything." The story aired 3 days later, watered-down version that presented the controversy as a difference of professional opinion rather than a serious safety concern. Richard Holbrook appeared on camera, confident and reassuring. "Colonel Harrington's military service is commendable, but his outdated methodology has been thoroughly reviewed and dismissed by current experts in the field." The city engineer added, "All designs have been verified against modern standards. The public can rest assured that the Westbrook Bridge will be safe and stable for generations." The following morning, James received a certified letter from Holbrook Engineering's legal department, threatening legal action for defamation and interference with business relations if he continued his campaign of baseless allegations. "They're trying to silence us," Sarah said when she saw the letter. "Standard intimidation tactic," James replied, setting the letter aside. "I've faced worse than lawyers." But Marcus had received more than a letter. He arrived at James's apartment ashen-faced. "I've been suspended pending an ethics investigation," he announced. "Richard claims I stole proprietary data and violated confidentiality agreements." "We'll fight this," Sarah insisted. Marcus shook his head. "My career is effectively over. No engineering firm will touch me after this." James felt the weight of responsibility. This young man had risked everything based on his convictions. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I never intended." "Don't apologize," Marcus interrupted. "I made my choice." He straightened his shoulders. "But now we'd better be right, because we've all got nothing left to lose." The three stood silently, looking at the bridge model where a small red light blinked steadily, the live feed from their monitoring. Equipment showing stress patterns gradually increasing with each passing day. "The first major storm system is approaching," Sarah said, checking the weather forecast on her phone, "predicted to hit in 5 days. Then we have 5 days to build a case they can't ignore," James replied, his voice resolute despite the doubts beginning to gnaw at him. "This system is intensifying beyond initial predictions," the meteorologist explained, pointing to swirling patterns on the radar display. "We're now expecting sustained winds of 40 to 50 miles per hour, with gusts potentially reaching 70 near the harbor." James, Sarah, and Marcus had sought out Dr. Eleanor Winters, head of meteorology at the university, hoping her expertise might add credibility to their concerns. And these wind patterns, James asked, will they create the cross-directional forces we discussed? Dr. Winters nodded gravely. The updrafts from the river valley, combined with the channeling effect between the downtown buildings, will create precisely the vortex conditions you've identified. She studied James's calculations. Your modeling of the fluid dynamics is impressive, Colonel. Most engineers overlook these microclimate factors. Most engineers haven't built bridges while watching how wind affects artillery trajectories, James replied. How certain are you about this storm's path? Sarah asked. 90%. Confidence it will hit the harbor directly, Dr. Winters confirmed. I'd stake my reputation on it. Would you be willing to put that in writing? Marcus asked. The meteorologist hesitated only briefly. Yes, this is a public safety issue. Armed with Dr. Winters' written assessment, they approached the city emergency management office, only to find themselves blocked at every turn. I understand your concerns, the deputy director said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. But we have assurances from Holbrook Engineering that the bridge can withstand far worse conditions than predicted. Those assurances are based on flawed models, James insisted. Colonel, the city has invested millions in this project. We can't halt construction based on alternative theories. Then at least restrict access to the construction site during the storm, Marcus pleaded. That decision lies with the project management team, the official replied, effectively dismissing them. Outside, rain had begun to fall, a precursor to the approaching system. They won't listen until it's too late, Marcus said bitterly. James watched workers on the bridge site, still laboring despite the deteriorating weather. We need to go above their heads. The mayor, Sarah suggested. Hire the governor. Sarah made calls, leveraging her academic connections, while James compiled their evidence into a comprehensive report. Marcus, with nothing left to lose professionally, reached out to former colleagues at other engineering firms, seeking independent validation of their concerns. By evening, the storm's leading edge had reached the coast. Wind-driven rain lashed against James's apartment windows as they prepared for a conference call with the governor's infrastructure safety advisor. This is our last chance, James told them as they waited for the call. If we can't convince them now, ... The call connected, but instead of the governor's advisor, Richard Holbrook's face appeared on the screen. Colonel Harrington, he said, his voice dripping with barely concealed anger. I understand you've been attempting an end run around proper channels we're trying to prevent a potential disaster, James replied calmly. By creating panic? By undermining confidence in a vital infrastructure project. Richard's facade of professionalism was cracking. The governor's office forwarded your concerns to me as the engineer of record. They considered this matter closed. The storm, Marcus began, is well within our design parameters, Richard interrupted. Perhaps if you hadn't violated your confidentiality agreements, Mr. Wells, you would know that. The call ended abruptly, leaving them staring at a blank screen. Sarah's phone chimed with a weather alert. She read it aloud. Storm warning upgraded to severe. All harbor traffic suspended. Residents in low-lying areas advised to evacuate. James looked out at the darkening sky. We've done everything by the book. Now we do it my way. What does that mean? Marcus asked. It means we go to the bridge ourselves, James replied, already reaching for his rain gear. Sometimes you have to stand on the ground to know what's really happening. Professor Gerald Takahashi stared at the data spread across his desk, his expression growing increasingly troubled. As the department chair of civil engineering at MIT, his opinion carried weight, which was precisely why Marcus had risked contacting him. These stress patterns, Professor Takahashi murmured, tapping the printouts. They're consistent with harmonic resonance building toward critical failure. That's what Colonel Harrington has been saying. Marcus confirmed via video call. Rain pelting the windows of Sarah's office, where they had established their makeshift command center. Who else has reviewed this data? The professor asked. We've tried everyone, the engineering board, city officials, even the governor's office. No one will listen. Professor Takahashi removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Richard Holbrook was my student once. Brilliant mind, but always too certain of his computer models. Will you help us? Sarah asked, joining the call. Send me everything you have. I'll convene an emergency peer review panel. Across town, James navigated through the storm to the construction site. His military-issue rain gear providing little protection against the intensifying winds. Pete met him at the security gate, looking concerned. You shouldn't be here, Colonel. They've ordered evacuation of all non-essential personnel. I need to check our sensors, James shouted over the wind. Pete hesitated, then handed James a hard hat and safety vest. 10 minutes. Then we're both out of here. The partially constructed bridge loomed ahead, skeletal and vulnerable. James made his way to the nearest pier, where their hidden monitoring equipment transmitted data to Sarah's computer. He secured the equipment against the storm, then paused, feeling the structure with his hands. Vibrations, subtle but unmistakable, exactly as he had predicted. His phone rang Sarah, barely audible over the storm. James, Professor Takahashi from MIT has reviewed our data. He's convening an emergency panel. The bridge is already showing harmonic vibration, James reported. How long until Takahashi can issue findings? Hours at least. But there's more. Marcus has been sharing our data with former colleagues. 2 other senior engineers have expressed concerns. They're contacting the State Engineering Board directly. For the first time in weeks, James felt hope. With credentialed experts backing their claims, officials would have to take action. As he made his way back to shore, James noticed a familiar figure huddled under the site office overhang. Richard Holbrook, staring at the bridge with an expression James recognized immediately. Doubt, seeing it for yourself? James asked, approaching the younger engineer. Richard's head snapped around. Surprise quickly replaced by defensive anger. Checking that my design is performing as expected. Which it is it? James gestured toward the structure, where the steel framework visibly swayed against the darkening sky. That oscillation pattern is it within your parameters? Richard's jaw tightened. Minor movement is expected in these conditions. That's not minor, and you know it. James held the younger man's gaze. It's not too late to admit there's a problem, Richard, and destroy my career. The firmness is a $500 million project. What's a career compared to lives? James asked quietly. I lost 4 men in Korea because an engineer wouldn't admit his mistake. Could you live with that kind of weight? Before Richard could respond, a security guard approached. Mr. Holbrook, there's an urgent call from Professor Takahashi at MIT. Richard's face paled. Takahashi, why would he? Understanding dawned in his eyes as he looked at James. What have you done? What you should have done weeks ago, James replied. Sought independent verification. As Richard hurried away, James's phone rang again. Marcus, his voice tight with excitement. The State Engineering Board is calling an emergency meeting. 3 senior engineers have now backed our findings. They're demanding an immediate inspection of the bridge. It's working, James said, relief washing over him. The truth is finally getting out. Where are you? Marcus asked, concern evident. In his voice, James looked up at the bridge, where workers were now hastily securing equipment against the worsening storm. Right where I need to be. The evidence is concerning enough to warrant precautionary measures, Professor Takahashi stated, firmly addressing the emergency meeting via video conference. Rain lashed against the windows of City Hall as officials, engineers, and emergency management personnel gathered in the crisis room. James sat silently beside Sarah and Marcus, letting the distinguished professor command the attention his own warnings had failed to garner. Based on independent analysis by myself and colleagues at Stanford and Caltech, the harmonic resonance patterns detected in the Westbrook Bridge support piers indicate potential structural compromise under current storm conditions. Mayor Jenkins leaned forward. Are you saying the bridge could collapse? I'm saying there's a significant probability of partial structural failure. If the weather conditions continue to deteriorate as predicted. Richard Holbrook paced at the back of the room, visibly agitated. These conclusions are based on unauthorized data collection and theoretical models that haven't been properly vetted. Actually, Professor Takahashi countered, we've verified The field measurements against standard engineering principles. The math is sound. Richard, the emergency management director, turned to James. Colonel Harrington, in your assessment, what's the risk level? All eyes turned to him. This was the moment he'd fought for, the chance to be heard by those with the power to act. The Eastern support piers are already showing vibrational patterns consistent with early-stage harmonic resonance failure, he explained calmly. As the storm intensifies over the next 3 hours, those vibrations will amplify. If they reach critical frequency, which my calculations suggest they will, the structural integrity of the eastern span will be compromised. Could we be overreacting? The city manager asked. Evacuations are costly, disruptive for men. Died at Imjin River because an officer asked that same question. James replied, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of personal tragedy. The cost of being wrong is measured in lives, not dollars. The room fell silent. I've reviewed Colonel Harrington's Korean War records, Professor Takahashi added unexpectedly. His emergency bridge designs saved countless lives under combat conditions. His understanding of practical engineering under stress conditions is exceptional. Richard finally approached the table. I stressed, if there's a design flaw, it would be my responsibility. His voice strained with the professional agony of the admission. I cannot, in good conscience, dismiss these concerns without further investigation. Mayor Jenkins studied the faces around the table, then nodded decisively. Implement evacuation protocols for all areas within a half-mile radius of the bridge site. All construction personnel are to withdraw immediately. As officials dispersed to execute the order, Richard approached James. This will likely end my career if you're right, and if I'm wrong, it will end mine, James replied. But we'll both sleep better, knowing we erred on the side of caution. Richard hesitated, then extended his hand. I still believe my design is sound, but I respect your persistence. James accepted the handshake, recognizing the professional courage it took for the younger engineer to concede even this much. Outside, emergency vehicles began moving into position as evacuation orders were transmitted. News crews gathered despite the storm, broadcasting live updates as residents and businesses within the evacuation zone prepared to leave. You did it, Sarah said, standing beside James as they watched the emergency response unfold. They finally listened. We did it, James corrected her. You and Marcus risked everything to support these findings. Marcus joined them, relief evident on his face. The sensors are showing increased vibration patterns. The storm's hitting exactly as predicted. James nodded, watching the partially constructed bridge swaying visibly now in the powerful winds. The evacuation's the right call, but we're not done yet. What do you mean? Sarah asked. We need to document exactly what happens, James replied. If that bridge shows the failure patterns we've predicted, we need irrefutable evidence. Otherwise, they'll just rebuild it with the same flawed design. The evacuation order includes us, Marcus pointed out. James looked at the young engineer, who had risked his career for this moment of vindication. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Rain hammered against the windshield as James drove his weathered truck toward the harbor observation point. Despite the mandatory evacuation order, he had convinced Sarah and Marcus that they needed to monitor the bridge's behavior during the storm's peak. East Harbor Police have established checkpoints on Madison and River Street, Sarah reported, studying her phone. We'll need to approach from the south. James nodded, taking a service road that wound behind the harbor warehouses. His years in Korea had taught him that official perimeters always had gaps. They parked in the shelter of an abandoned shipping facility, approximately 400 yards from the bridge site, but with a clear view of the eastern support piers, the critical section where James had predicted failure would begin. Remote monitoring station is operational, Marcus announced from the back seat, where he had set up a laptop connected to their sensors. We're getting live data from all points except sensor 4 must have been damaged in the storm. The bridge loomed before them, steel and concrete stark against the churning sky. Construction equipment had been hastily secured or removed, creating a strange stillness at the normally bustling site. Look at the eastern span, James said, passing binoculars to Sarah. See the oscillation pattern. She watched for several moments. It's moving more than the western section. Exactly. The vortex effect is already creating differential forces. Marcus studied the incoming data. Vibration frequency increasing on the eastern supports. We're seeing amplitudes 20% higher than the western side. James made notes in his Korean War notebook, the same battered volume that had once recorded calculations for bridges under artillery fire. The harmonic pattern is developing precisely as predicted. A police cruiser rolled slowly past their position, searchlight sweeping the area. They ducked down until it passed. They're serious about this evacuation, Sarah whispered. As they should be, James replied. The storm intensified as darkness fell. Wind gusts reached near hurricane force, driving rain horizontally across the harbor. Their truck rocked with each powerful blast. Sensor 5 is showing critical stress levels, Marcus reported, his voice tight with tension. The eastern pier is experiencing microfractures along the predicted failure plane. James watched through the binoculars, his expression grim. It's happening. The oscillations had become visible even without magnification. The eastern section of the bridge framework swaying rhythmically, each movement slightly larger than the last as the harmonic resonance built upon itself. We should alert emergency services, Sarah suggested. They're already on high alert, James replied, and we're not supposed to be here. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a thunderous crack. For a moment, James was transported back to Korea, to artillery fire and desperate calculations made under combat conditions. Someone's coming, Marcus warned, pointing to headlights approaching along the service road. The vehicle stopped behind their truck, its high beams blinding them. A figure emerged, struggling against the wind. It's Richard, Sarah said with surprise, as the engineer reached their vehicle. James opened his door. What are you doing here? Rain soaked Richard instantly as he climbed into the truck. Same as you, watching my career end in real time. Despite his words, his expression showed more concern than bitterness. The sensors at headquarters are showing the same patterns. I had to see for myself. Another lightning flash revealed the bridge, now visibly distressed. The eastern support pier had developed a hairline fracture along its upper section. There, James pointed. First, structural compromise. Richard stared in professional horror. That's not possible. The safety factors were calculated without accounting for the eastern vortex effect, James finished. The real-world conditions exceed your models. The four sat in silence. 2 generations of engineers watching as nature methodically exposed the limits of human calculation. It's going to fail, isn't it? Richard finally asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. James nodded solemnly. Yes, but thanks to the evacuation, it won't take lives with it. As if in response to his words, a section of temporary scaffolding tore free from the eastern pier, cartwheeling into the churning river below. Frequency matching approaching critical threshold, Marcus announced, eyes fixed on his laptop screen. The data feed showed escalating stress patterns across the eastern support structure, numbers flashing from yellow to red as safety margins evaporated. Richard leaned forward, professional dismay evident on his face. The harmonic amplification is happening faster than any model would predict. Not any model, James corrected quietly, just the standard ones. Another lightning flash illuminated the bridge, now visibly distressed. The eastern pier's fracture had widened, concrete crumbling along its edge. The steel framework above swayed, in an unnatural rhythm, each oscillation building upon the last. We need to report this, Sarah insisted, reaching for her phone. Already done, Richard replied. I alerted the emergency command center before I arrived. They're monitoring remotely, but can't deploy inspection teams in these conditions. James studied the bridge through his binoculars, decades of experience, allowing him to read its movements like a physician monitoring vital signs. The primary stress point is migrating upward along the eastern pier. When it reaches the junction with the horizontal span, a sharp crack interrupted him, audible even above the howling wind. A section of concrete sheeting tore away from the upper portion of the pier, crashing into the churning water below. Secondary failure initiating, James noted with clinical detachment, making entries in his notebook even as the evidence of his predictions unfolded before them. Richard's professional composure cracked. This isn't just a localized stress issue. The entire Eastern support system is compromised. He turned to James. You were right, completely right. Being right doesn't fix the bridge, James replied, but it might prevent the next disaster. Marcus's laptop emitted an urgent alert. Structural integrity dropping below 30% on the eastern connection points. Total failure imminent. The truck's radio crackled to life emergency broadcast, cutting through all channels. Attention all personnel. Bridge showing critical structural compromise. All units maintain safe distance. Repeat, maintain safe distance. We should move back, Sarah urged, eyeing the increasingly unstable structure. James shook his head. Not yet. We need to document the exact failure sequence. Documentation won't matter if we're hit by debris, Richard argued. We're outside the collapse radius, James assured him, though his certainty came more from combat instinct than engineering calculations. This position gives us the optimal observation angle. Another violent gust rocked the truck. On the bridge, the eastern framework twisted unnaturally, metal screaming against metal as the harmonic vibrations reached critical amplitude. It's happening, James said, raising his binoculars again, precisely as the calculations predicted. For watched in horrified fascination as the laws of physics, so confidently managed in architectural drawings and computer models, reasserted their ultimate authority. The eastern pier's upper section buckled, no longer able to maintain structural integrity against the combined forces of gravity, wind, and harmonic resonance. With a thunderous roar, the eastern span collapsed, twisting as it fell into the churning river below. The collapse stopped precisely at the secondary support junction, exactly where James had calculated the failure would be contained. My God, Richard whispered. Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard, documenting everything. Time of failure. Sequence, correlation with predicted stress patterns, all recorded. Sarah stared at James. You weren't just right about the failure. You correctly predicted exactly where it would stop. James closed his notebook, suddenly feeling every one of his 62 years. It's the same math I used in Korea. Physics doesn't change, even when our understanding of it improves. Richard's phone rang, the emergency command center demanding updates. As he described the collapse, James stepped out of the truck, rain soaking him instantly as he stood watching the wounded bridge, a structure half standing, half fallen, a monument to both human ingenuity and human fallibility. In that moment, he wasn't thinking of vindication. He was remembering for young men who had died at Imjin River because an engineer had been too proud to admit a mistake. The western section is still showing stress anomalies, James announced, studying the data feeds on Marcus's laptop. Dawn was breaking over the harbor, the storm's fury finally abating after hours of relentless assault. Richard looked up from his phone. Emergency services want us to evacuate immediately. They're concerned about progressive collapse. Not yet, James insisted. The western pier is holding, but there's something happening at the central junction that doesn't match any of our models. Sarah touched his arm. James, we've been here all night. We've documented the failure. It's time to go. You three go, he replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. I need to stay and monitor the secondary stress patterns. Marcus protested. The authorities are clearing everyone to a 1-mile perimeter. We don't have a choice. I've disobeyed. Worse orders for better reasons, James said, the ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. This isn't just about documenting a failure anymore. It's about understanding how to prevent the next one. Richard studied the old colonel with newfound respect. What exactly are you seeing? James pointed to anomalous readings from their remaining sensors. The western structure is redistributing loads in a pattern I've only seen once before Imjin River. 1953. If I'm right, we have a chance to save the rest of the bridge. But only if we understand exactly how the stress is migrating. Richard hesitated, torn between professional curiosity and safety protocols. The emergency teams won't approach until the structure stabilizes, which is why I need to stay, James replied. Someone has to observe what happens next. After a tense discussion, they reached a compromise. Sarah and Marcus would evacuate with all their documentation, ensuring their evidence was preserved. Richard and James would remain until the last possible moment, gathering crucial data on the bridge's behavior. 30 minutes, Richard told. The emergency coordinator over the phone will be out in 30 minutes. As Sarah and Marcus departed, James positioned himself where he could observe the critical junction point. Richard set up a real-time data link to the emergency command center, ensuring their observations would be transmitted even if they had to evacuate suddenly. In Korea, James said as they worked, "We learned that bridges don't just fall, they talk to you first if you know how to listen." They didn't teach that at MIT, Richard admitted. Some things can't be taught in classrooms. James adjusted his binoculars. There, see that deflection pattern along the western truss. It's redistributing stress dynamically, Richard observed with growing appreciation for the older engineer's intuition. The secondary supports are adapting better than the models predicted. Because your models treat concrete as uniform, James explained. But real-world concrete has microscopic variations that sometimes work in our favor. A creaking groan emanated from the bridge as a gust of wind caught the damaged structure. That sound, James noted, indicates metal fatigue beginning at the connection points. He made rapid calculations in his notebook. We have approximately 20 minutes before the western section reaches critical stress. We should leave now, Richard urged. Not yet. There's something else happening. As the minutes ticked by, James observed and documented with the focused precision of a combat engineer. Richard found himself following the older man's lead, learning more about practical structural behavior in those tense moments than in years of theoretical study. At the 20-minute mark, James finally nodded. We have what we need. The western section is stabilizing. Those connection bolts are stronger than their specifications. As they hurried back to Richard's vehicle, the younger engineer asked, "Was it worth the risk?" James looked back at the partially collapsed bridge. In Korea, I once stayed behind when everyone else evacuated. Found a stress pattern nobody had predicted. The information saved 3 bridges and dozens of lives later in the campaign. Richard nodded slowly, beginning to understand that engineering wasn't just about calculations and computer models. Sometimes, it required the courage to stand and observe when everyone else had retreated to safety. Preliminary assessment confirms catastrophic harmonic resonance failure, exactly as Colonel Harrington predicted. Professor Takahashi reported to the assembled city officials and engineers. 3 days after the partial collapse, the response had transitioned to investigation and assessment. James sat quietly in the back of the conference room, still exhausted from the ordeal. The doctors had warned him about pneumonia after his extended exposure to the storm, but he had insisted on attending this critical meeting. Mayor Jenkins addressed the room soberly. The evacuation prevented casualties, but we need to understand how this happened and who's responsible. All eyes turned to Richard Holbrook, who stood to face his colleagues and superiors. The responsibility is mine, he stated firmly. As engineer of record, I failed to adequately consider site-specific conditions identified by Colonel Harrington. He paused, visibly struggling with the professional humiliation. My models were technically correct, but insufficiently comprehensive. I dismissed critical variables because they didn't fit standard methodologies. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken when James rose slowly to his feet. Engineering isn't just about following established procedures, he said, his voice still rough from hours in the storm. It's about understanding when those procedures need adaptation. He nodded toward Richard. Mr. Holbrook showed considerable courage in acknowledging the warning signs before catastrophic failure. His actions during the storm helped document crucial stress patterns that will improve future designs. Professor Takahashi stepped forward. I concur. While the initial design was flawed, Mr. Holbrook's real-time observations during the event provided invaluable data. The failure was contained to the eastern section precisely because we understood the progression pattern. The city engineer cleared his throat. What are the implications for reconstruction? We'll need to completely redesign the eastern section, Richard replied, bringing up diagrams on the projection screen. But Colonel Harrington's observations confirmed that the western foundations remained sound. He displayed a new design concept. I've incorporated the Colonel's harmonic resonance calculations and his field observations from the storm. The revised design includes adaptive damping systems to prevent oscillation buildup. James studied the new plans with professional appreciation. The asymmetrical support structure accounts for the eastern vortex effect. Very elegant solution. It's largely based on your Korean War bridge designs, Richard admitted. Sometimes old methods are still the best methods. The meeting continued with technical discussions about reconstruction timelines and budgets. When it concluded, James found himself surrounded by engineers eager to discuss his unorthodox but effective approach to the crisis. Later, in the hospital, where doctors had insisted he undergo observation for exposure and exhaustion, James received an unexpected visitor. Richard arrived, carrying a leather-bound book. "The board asked me to deliver this," he said, placing it on James's bedside table. "It's the official record of the investigation." James opened the cover to find his name prominently mentioned in the acknowledgments, his calculations reproduced in full, his methods described as innovative application of field engineering principles. "They're also naming the reconstruction effort after you," Richard added. "The Harrington approach, they're calling it. A methodology for integrating practical field observations with theoretical models." James closed the book, uncomfortable with the attention. The methodology isn't what matters. It's remembering that behind every calculation are potential lives at risk. Richard nodded solemnly. "I won't forget that lesson again." He hesitated, then added, "I've been asked to lead a review of 3 other bridges in the region, looking for similar vulnerabilities. I was hoping you might consider consulting." James raised an eyebrow. "Consulting? At my age seems to be an advantage in your case," Richard replied. "Your experience sees things our computers miss." Before James could respond, the door opened again as Sarah and Marcus arrived, bringing news that the State Engineering Board had formally exonerated Marcus of all ethical violations. "They're calling us heroes," Sarah reported, showing James the newspaper headlines. James shook his head. "We just did our jobs. The real victory is that no one died this time." As his visitors chatted excitedly about the professional recognition now coming their way, James gazed out the window toward the harbor, where the partially collapsed bridge stood as a testament to both human error and human perseverance. For young men from Korea would never see their vindication. But perhaps, in some small way, James had finally honored their sacrifice. "The key innovation is this adaptive damping system," James explained, pointing to the detailed schematic. 6 months after the collapse, the redesigned Westbrook Bridge was taking shape, incorporating principles drawn from both cutting-edge engineering and James's battlefield experience. The conference room at Holbrook Engineering had been transformed into a collaborative workspace where computers and hand calculations existed side by side. Young engineers gathered around James, absorbing methods not taught in any university. "We're essentially allowing the bridge to flex intentionally at these designated points," he continued. "Rather than fighting the harmonic vibrations, we're channeling them through these dampening stations." Richard nodded appreciatively. "It's counterintuitive. Most engineers try to eliminate movement entirely." "Nature always moves," James replied. "The trick is working with it rather than against it." The partnership between the 2 men had surprised everyone, most of all themselves. Richard's theoretical expertise complemented James's practical knowledge, creating a methodology that was gaining attention throughout the engineering community. Later that afternoon, they walked the construction site together, inspecting progress on the new foundation piers. "The Eastern Vortex mitigation system is performing exactly as your calculations predicted," Richard noted, reviewing data on his tablet. "Flow patterns are disrupted before they can generate harmonic forces." James knelt to examine the concrete work, running his scarred hands over the surface. "Good consistency. Your new quality control protocols are working." A group of engineering students from the State University approached, part of an educational program instituted after the collapse. Richard had insisted that practical field experience become mandatory for all civil engineering degrees. "Colonel Harrington," one student asked, "is it true you calculated the harmonic resonance factors without computer modeling?" James smiled. "Computers are powerful tools, but they're only as good as the assumptions programmed into them. Sometimes you need to feel the problem with your hands." As Richard led the students through a technical explanation of the new design, James walked to the edge of the site, gazing across the harbor, where the two communities long separated by more than just water were beginning to reconnect. Sarah joined him, now serving as liaison between the university and the project team. "The Harrington method is being incorporated into next year's engineering curriculum," she reported. "Your battlefield calculations are becoming textbook material." James shook his head, still uncomfortable with the recognition. "Just practical solutions to immediate problems." "That's exactly why they're valuable," she insisted. "Too many engineers get lost in theory without understanding real-world conditions." Back at the planning center, Marcus, fully reinstated and now leading his own design team, was introducing modifications to the pedestrian walkway. "We've incorporated Colonel Harrington's observations about human movement patterns," he explained to city officials. "The slight curve follows natural walking tendencies, reducing congestion at access points." James observed with quiet satisfaction. His advocacy for human factors in engineering, another lesson from his military days, was being embraced by a new generation. That evening, the team gathered for a progress review. Richard displayed the latest timeline projections. "We're on schedule for completion next spring," he announced, "thanks in no small part to our consulting engineers' efficiency recommendations." James acknowledged the comment with a nod. His suggestion to run concurrent operations rather than sequential construction, standard practice in military engineering, but rare in civilian projects, had shaved months from the schedule. As the meeting concluded, Richard addressed the room. "One final announcement. The board has approved Colonel Harrington's proposal for a new safety verification protocol. From now on, all major projects will undergo both computer modeling and hands-on field assessment before approval." The engineers applauded, many looking toward James with newfound respect. The old soldier who had once been mocked for his outdated methods had transformed their approach to engineering safety. After everyone departed, James remained, studying the bridge designs one last time before heading home. His Korean War notebook lay open beside sophisticated computer models, old wisdom informing new technology, experience guiding innovation. For the first time in decades, the ghosts of Imjin River seemed quieter. Perhaps they too recognized that their sacrifice had not been forgotten. 1 year later, James stood at attention beneath a cloudless sky, watching as the mayor cut the ribbon spanning the completed Westbrook Bridge. The gleaming structure stretched across the harbor, not merely connecting to communities, but symbolizing a new approach to engineering, one that married theoretical precision with practical wisdom. This bridge stands as a testament to innovation, collaboration, and perseverance, Mayor Jenkins announced to the gathered crowd. But most importantly, it represents our commitment to public safety above all other considerations. James listened. From the second row, uncomfortable in his dress uniform, but Sarah had insisted he wear it for the occasion. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight's silent reminders of battles fought long ago. "We now invite Colonel James Harrington to unveil the dedication plaque," the mayor continued. James stepped forward reluctantly, the crowd's applause washing over him. He had tried to decline this honor, but Richard had been insistent. "Some things transcend professional courtesy," the younger engineer had said. The bronze plaque was covered with a velvet cloth. James drew it away to reveal not his own name, as he had feared, but a different inscription, in honor of Lieutenant David Peterson, Sergeant Michael Mitchell, Corporal Anthony Santos, and Private Robert Dawkins, who gave their lives at Imjin River, 1953. Their sacrifice reminds us that engineering excellence is not measured in awards, but in lives protected. Safety before pride, people before profit. James stared at the names he had carried in his heart for decades, now immortalized in bronze. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find John Mercer, his old sergeant, seated in a wheelchair. Beside him, "You did it, Colonel," John said, his voice frail but his eyes bright. "You finally brought our boys home." The formal ceremony gave way to celebration as the bridge opened to pedestrians for the first time. James walked its length, with Richard, Sarah, and Marcus inspecting the completed work with professional satisfaction. "The harmonic damping systems are performing perfectly," Richard reported, showing James the monitoring data. "Even under high wind conditions, the oscillation patterns remain well within safety parameters." "The eastern vortex," James asked, disrupted. "Exactly as your calculations predicted," Marcus confirmed. "The flow pattern never builds enough energy to create resonance." At the center of the bridge, they paused at a small observation area where educational displays explained the engineering principles behind the structure. Among them was a glass case containing James's Korean War notebook, open to the pages, where he had first calculated the harmonic resonance factors. "The Harrington method is being taught in engineering programs across the country," Sarah told him. "Your battlefield calculations are changing how we think about structural dynamics." James nodded, but his attention was on the families crossing the bridge, parents with children, elderly couples, young people on bicycles, all unaware of the battles fought to ensure their safety. Later that afternoon, James found himself in a lecture hall at the State University, facing a class of civil engineering students. Richard had convinced him to speak about practical field engineering, though public speaking had never been his strength. "Engineering isn't just about following formulas," he told the attentive students. "It's about understanding that behind every calculation is a human life that depends on you getting it right." He shared stories from Korea, from bridges built under fire and structures tested not in laboratories but in combat conditions. He explained how the Westbrook Bridge failure had been predicted using principles learned decades earlier in very different circumstances. "The technology changes," he concluded. "The materials improve. But the fundamental responsibility of an engineer remains constant: to put safety above pride, and to remember that admitting a mistake is not weakness, but the highest form of professional courage." As the students applauded, James noticed Richard, standing at the back of the hall, nodding in agreement. The two men, once adversaries, now collaborators, had forged a partnership that was changing engineering practice for the better. That evening, James returned to the bridge, now quieter as dusk fell. He stood at the plaque honoring his fallen comrades, remembering their faces, their voices, their trust in his calculations. "We got it right this time," he told them softly, and for the first time in decades, he felt not just the weight of their loss, but the satisfaction of a debt finally repaid, a bridge not just of steel and concrete, but of time and memory, connecting the hard lessons of the past to a safer future.